Welcome back to our channel. Tonight, we explore the story of Napoleon Bonaparte's downfall through two pivotal battles that mark the end of his empire, one being the Battle of Leipzig and the other the Battle of Waterloo. As always, relax and enjoy the story. Let's begin. From the ashes of revolution rose an empire, but on the fields around Leipzig in October 1813, destiny awaited its dramatic fall. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, found himself surrounded. Over 500,000 soldiers converged on this battleground. Coalition forces from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden arrayed against Napoleon's French army and its remaining allies. This massive confrontation, known as the Battle of Leipzig or the Battle of Nations, would become one of history's defining moments. The path to this decisive battlefield had been paved with Napoleon's greatest mistake, the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. This catastrophic venture had decimated his once mighty Grande Armée, from over 600,000 men to a mere 30,000 combat-ready soldiers, marking the beginning of the end for French dominance over Europe. As the continent's powers sensed Napoleon's weakness, his carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states that had served as a buffer between France and its enemies, wavered in its loyalty. Prussia, long humiliated by French occupation, saw an opportunity to reassert its independence and restore its former glory. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, conquered territories and puppet states grew restless, anticipating the empire's fall. Seizing this moment of French vulnerability, a new coalition of European powers emerged. This sixth coalition brought together an unprecedented alliance of nations determined to end French hegemony once and for all. At its core were four major powers: Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, each with its own motivations for joining the fight against Napoleon. Russia, having repelled Napoleon's invasion, sought to capitalize on its victory and expand its influence in Europe. Tsar Alexander I, once an ally of Napoleon, now saw himself as the liberator of Europe from French tyranny. Prussia, under King Frederick William III, burned with a desire for revenge and national restoration. The Prussian reformers had spent years modernizing the army and instilling a sense of patriotic fervor in the population. Austria, under Emperor Francis I, had maintained a cautious neutrality in the early stages of the conflict. However, as the tide turned against Napoleon, Austria saw an opportunity to regain lost territories and reassert its position as a major European power. Sweden, led by the former French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, joined the coalition with the promise of acquiring Norway from Denmark, Napoleon's ally. The geopolitical landscape of Europe in 1813 was a complex web of shifting alliances and competing interests. Great Britain provided substantial financial support to the coalition through subsidies and loans. Spain and Portugal, with British assistance, continued their struggle against French occupation in the Peninsular War, tying down significant French forces. In response to this growing threat, Napoleon worked feverishly to rebuild his army. He ordered a massive conscription effort, calling up young men and even teenagers to fill the ranks. The French emperor's ability to raise and equip new forces in a short time was remarkable, but the quality of these hastily trained troops could not match that of his veterans lost in Russia. Germany emerged as the strategic fulcrum of the conflict. Its central location made it the ideal battleground for the upcoming confrontation between Napoleon and the coalition forces. Control of Germany would determine access to resources, lines of communication, and the ability to project power across Europe. Napoleon recognized the importance of maintaining his grip on the German states, particularly Saxony, which remained loyal to him. As spring turned to summer in 1813, tensions mounted across Europe. The coalition armies began to mobilize, with Russian and Prussian forces advancing westward. Austria engaged in frantic diplomacy, trying to negotiate a peaceful settlement while secretly preparing for war. Napoleon, sensing the gathering storm, launched a preemptive campaign in Germany, hoping to defeat his enemies before they could fully unite. The stage was set for a confrontation of unprecedented scale. The fate of Europe hung in the balance as hundreds of thousands of soldiers converged on the heart of Germany. Leipzig, a prosperous city in Saxony, would soon become the focal point of this titanic struggle. Situated at the confluence of the Elster and Pleiss rivers, the Saxon city offered a complex battlefield of marshlands and open ground that would test the tactical acumen of both sides. Like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the sheer magnitude of the assembling forces foreshadowed the tempest to come. The coalition armies, comprising troops from Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden, amassed an overwhelming force of approximately 360,000 soldiers, supported by 1,500 guns. In contrast, Napoleon's Grande Armée, once the terror of Europe, now stood at a mere 225,000 troops with 700 guns. This significant numerical disadvantage placed immense pressure on the French emperor's legendary strategic brilliance. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon remained confident in his ability to emerge victorious. His initial strategy focused on taking the offensive between the Pleiss and Parthe rivers, aiming to concentrate his forces for a decisive strike against the coalition's army of Bohemia under Schwarzenberg. This aggressive approach reflected Napoleon's understanding that he could not afford a prolonged engagement against superior numbers. The coalition, however, had learned from their past defeats. Their Trachenberg plan represented a paradigm shift in their approach to combating Napoleon. Like a chess player anticipating moves ahead, the plan emphasized attacking smaller French detachments and disrupting supply lines, gradually wearing down the French forces while avoiding the pitched battles where Napoleon's tactical genius often prevailed. To implement this plan, the coalition forces were organized into four main commands: the Army of Bohemia, the Army of Silesia, the Army of the North, and the Army of Poland. Each command comprised multinational components, a deliberate structure designed to ensure that no single nation dominated the command hierarchy. This arrangement fostered cooperation while also addressing the complex political dynamics within the coalition. As the battle loomed, both sides grappled with their respective strengths and weaknesses. The coalition's numerical superiority was tempered by the challenges of coordinating such a diverse force. Napoleon, on the other hand, commanded a more cohesive force, battle-hardened and loyal to their emperor. Yet the French army was stretched thin, with many of its most experienced veterans lost in the disastrous Russian campaign. The presence of allied monarchs on the battlefield added a unique dimension to the impending conflict. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, in particular, took a hands-on approach, personally involving himself in the planning and execution of the battle. This direct involvement of heads of state underscored the unprecedented stakes of the confrontation, elevating it beyond a mere military engagement to a clash that would determine the fate of empires. On the eve of battle, an eerie calm settled over the fields surrounding Leipzig. The atmosphere among the troops was electric with tension, a palpable mix of anxiety and determination permeating both camps. Soldiers on both sides were acutely aware of the historical significance of the moment. They stood on the precipice of the largest battle the continent had ever witnessed, with the future of Europe hanging in the balance. As night fell, the armies took their positions, poised for the conflict that would erupt at dawn. The French forces consolidated their defensive lines, with Napoleon personally inspecting key positions and offering words of encouragement to his men. Across the field, coalition commanders made their final preparations, methodically arranging their vast forces according to the carefully crafted battle plans. The first light of dawn broke over Leipzig on October 16, 1813, illuminating a scene of impending chaos. The coalition forces launched a massive assault on Napoleon's southern flank, with General Kleist's Prussian corps advancing along the Pleiss River toward their objective. The village of Markkleeberg, defended by Prince Józef Poniatowski's Polish troops, Markkleeberg would soon become the epicenter of a brutal struggle. The early morning hours witnessed a ferocious contest for control of Markkleeberg. Prussian troops stormed the village, engaging Poniatowski's Poles in fierce combat. Despite their valiant defense, Poniatowski's forces were eventually forced to yield the village. However, the Prussians found themselves unable to capitalize on this hard-won victory. French artillery unleashed a devastating barrage that pinned Kleist's men in place, preventing any further advance until well after 10 a.m. As the southern front erupted into violence, Allied troops under Eugen of Württemberg seized the town of Wachau, but their success was short-lived. Like their Prussian counterparts in Markkleeberg, Eugen's forces found themselves at the mercy of French cannon fire. By 11 a.m., the initial momentum of the Allied attack had dissipated. Napoleon ordered a massive counterattack, unleashing 150 cannons on Kleist's and Prince Eugen's positions. The thunderous roar of artillery fire signaled a shift in the tide of battle. Napoleon set his broader counteroffensive in motion. Marshal Etienne MacDonald threatened the Allied right flank, while a wave of French forces swept forward in dense attack columns. Marshals Poniatowski, Victor, Oudinot, and Augereau led their units in a coordinated push. In a moment of high drama, Joachim Murat led a massive cavalry charge. At the head of 10,000 horsemen, Murat thundered across the battlefield. Kleist's Prussian corps bore the brunt of this onslaught. The Allied lines buckled under the weight of Murat's charge, which drove deep into enemy territory, coming close to Tsar Alexander's command post. However, the marshy ground slowed the cavalry's momentum, and the French infantry failed to provide timely support. As the day wore on, the villages of Markkleeberg, Wachau, and Liebert-Volkwitz changed hands multiple times. Soldiers on both sides displayed remarkable courage and endurance. The coalition troops showed tenacity in regrouping and launching counterattacks. Napoleon's forces, though outnumbered, demonstrated their experience and skill in holding their ground. The role of artillery proved crucial. Both sides employed their guns to devastating effect, dictating the flow of infantry and cavalry movements. The French used their artillery with precision, creating killing zones that stalled Allied advances and provided cover for their own maneuvers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first day of the Battle of Leipzig came to a brutal close. Exhausted and bloodied, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The day had ended in a costly stalemate. 25,000 French casualties, 30,000 Allied losses, and the fields south of Leipzig strewn with the dead and dying, silent witnesses to the ferocity of the fight. Yet the battle was far from over. While an uneasy quiet settled over the southern front, the struggle raged on elsewhere. To the north and west of Leipzig, fresh clashes erupted, where critical engagements would soon determine the fate of the conflict. The northern front was dominated by the Battle of Muckern, where Blücher commanded Langeron's Russian and York's Prussian corps against Marmont's 6th Corps. Marmont's troops, considered one of the best in the French army, faced relentless Prussian attacks. The battle quickly devolved into brutal close-quarters combat, with French defenders using the village's structures as improvised fortifications. As the fighting intensified, Marmont found himself in a precarious position. His cavalry commander's refusal to charge forced Marmont to launch an attack with infantry alone. This decision proved costly, as the French troops suffered significant casualties without cavalry support. The insubordination highlighted the growing cracks in the French command structure. The battle at Meukern raged on well into the night, with both sides locked in a deadly embrace. Artillery fire thundered across the battlefield, causing the majority of the casualties. By the time the fighting subsided, approximately 16,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded on the field. While Meukern burned, another crucial engagement unfolded on the Western Front. At Lindenau, a suburb of Leipzig, the Austrian Third Corps under General Blücher initially made significant headway. The Austrian advance threatened to cut off a potential French retreat route, forcing Marshal Ney to divert General Bertrand's Fourth Corps to hold the position. The redeployment of Bertrand's corps weakened Napoleon's offensive capabilities, limiting his options as the battle progressed. These troops, originally intended to participate in the Emperor's main attack, were now tied down in a defensive action. The simultaneous battles on the northern and western fronts resembled a complex chess match, with the disciplined but isolated French defense struggling against the multifaceted, chaotic coalition efforts. While the French held their ground with precision, the Allies pressed from multiple directions, seeking to exploit any weakness in Napoleon's strategy. The fighting at Lindenau matched the intensity at Meukern. French and Austrian troops grappled for control of the suburb, with the tide of battle ebbing and flowing throughout the day. Despite Gayulet's initial success, the French managed to hold their ground, preventing the Austrians from severing this crucial lifeline. As night fell on October 16th, both fronts had settled into an uneasy stalemate. The French had maintained their positions, but at a terrible cost in men and material. The losses sustained further strained Napoleon's already stretched resources, weakening his army's ability to respond to future coalition attacks. The day's fighting highlighted the crucial role of individual commanders in shaping the battle's outcome. Blücher's aggressive tactics at Meukern drew French forces away from the southern front, allowing the coalition to maintain pressure on Napoleon's lines. This decision exemplified the Prussian general's understanding of the larger strategic picture, as he sought to create opportunities for his allies, even as he engaged in his own fierce struggle. On the French side, Marmont's handling of the situation at Meukern demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Napoleon's command structure. While Marmont showed resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, the breakdown in discipline and coordination would prove increasingly costly as the battle wore on. The toll of combat on the troops was severe. Both Allied and French soldiers had been pushed to their physical and mental limits, enduring relentless hours of brutal, close-quarters fighting. Nowhere was this more evident than at Meukern, where men battled fiercely from house to house and street to street. The survivors of that harrowing engagement would carry its scars, both visible and unseen, for the rest of their lives. Yet war offered no respite. As the sun rose on October 17th, an eerie calm settled over the battlefield, masking the storm to come. Though the guns had momentarily fallen silent behind the lines, both armies braced for the next decisive confrontation. This fragile pause, like the eye of a hurricane, was merely the prelude to an even greater fury. The arrival of reinforcements dramatically altered the strategic landscape. Napoleon received 14,000 troops with Regnier's French-Saxon 7th Corps, while the coalition's ranks swelled by over 145,000 fresh soldiers. Colloredo's Austrian 1st Corps, Bennigsen's Army of Poland, and Bernadotte's Army of the North joined the Allied camp, tipping the scales decisively in their favour. Faced with overwhelming odds, Napoleon chose to stand his ground rather than retreat. This decision, driven by a desperate need to maintain his position, would shape the course of the battle and his imperial ambitions. The French camp grappled with low morale and dwindling supplies, epitomized by a chilling report. All ammunition stocks have been used up. The slightest delay in ammunition resupply could cause us heavy losses, as we have not enough to maintain combat for 1 hour. In contrast, the coalition forces were invigorated by their recent reinforcements and the prospect of encircling Napoleon. The disparity between the two sides grew increasingly apparent as the day progressed, with the French struggling to maintain their positions, while the Allies prepared for a coordinated assault. Both sides engaged in efforts to resupply and reorganize their forces. The French focused on consolidating their positions, acutely aware of their diminishing resources. Every crate of ammunition and morsel of food became precious as they braced for the coming storm. The coalition methodically planned a series of coordinated attacks, leveraging their newfound numerical superiority. Diplomatic maneuvers unfolded behind the scenes. Napoleon attempted to negotiate an armistice with the coalition, suggesting concessions to Emperor Francis I. However, the Allies, united in their purpose and aware of their advantage, rebuffed these overtures. Coalition leaders, sensing victory within their grasp, were determined to press their advantage and bring an end to Napoleon's dominance in Europe. The strategic planning for the next day's battle revealed the shifting dynamics of power. Coalition commanders agreed on 6 coordinated attacks designed to encircle and overwhelm Napoleon's forces. This comprehensive plan demonstrated the Allies' growing confidence and their ability to leverage their numerical superiority, leaving Napoleon with little room for his characteristic tactical brilliance. As night fell, both sides prepared for the decisive confrontation. The French, despite their precarious position, drew upon their experience and the lingering aura of Napoleon's leadership. They fortified their positions, distributed what little ammunition remained, and steeled themselves for the coming onslaught. Many soldiers wrote letters home, aware that the following day might be their last. The coalition forces buzzed with anticipation, their camp transformed into a bustling city of tents and campfires. Commanders issued orders, scouts reported on French positions, and soldiers sharpened their weapons. The air was thick with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, as even the most seasoned veterans recognized the historical significance of the impending battle. The day of respite had altered the course of the battle, setting the stage for a dramatic climax to Napoleon's imperial ambitions. As night fell, both armies stood on the precipice of history, bracing for the decisive confrontation that would shape the fate of Europe. All eyes turned to the coming dawn, when the final clash would determine the future of a continent. When October 18th dawned, the air crackled with tension. Across the battlefield, soldiers steeled themselves for the storm ahead. The question on every mind was the same. How would Napoleon respond to the overwhelming Allied force now poised against him? The answer would not only decide the battle, but redraw the map of Europe itself. The coalition forces launched a coordinated assault against Napoleon's army, executing a carefully orchestrated plan of 6 simultaneous attacks. Their strategy aimed to encircle and decisively defeat the French, exploiting their numerical superiority and the weakened state of Napoleon's troops. The French, acutely aware of their precarious position, had fortified their defences, particularly in the village of Probstheide, which became a focal point of the day's brutal fighting. Probstheide, a small village south of Leipzig, transformed into a crucible of carnage as the battle unfolded. Napoleon had recognized its strategic importance in controlling the southern front and bolstered its defences with artillery and infantry reserves. The Allied forces launched relentless assaults against the French position, with soldiers from both sides engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The arrival of Bernadotte's Army of the North significantly bolstered the Allied offensive. Bernadotte, a former French marshal who had switched allegiances, brought not only additional troops but also intimate knowledge of Napoleon's tactics. His presence on the battlefield served as a stark reminder of the changing tides of war and loyalty. A pivotal moment in the day's fighting came with the defection of 5,400 Saxon troops to the coalition. These soldiers, who had previously fought under Bernadotte's command, abandoned their French allies mid-battle. The sight of their former comrades joining the enemy ranks dealt a severe blow to French morale, already strained by the relentless Allied attacks and dwindling supplies. Throughout the day, the air reverberated with the thunderous exchange of artillery fire. Both sides engaged in intense duels, with cannon blasts tearing through formations and reducing villages to smouldering ruins. The French, despite their skill and determination, found themselves at a disadvantage as their ammunition stocks rapidly depleted. By afternoon, Napoleon's forces faced a dire situation, with only 20,000 rounds of ammunition remaining, barely enough to sustain combat for another hour. Napoleon, the master tactician, frantically searched for a weakness in the Allied lines that he could exploit. He directed attacks and counterattacks, hoping to create an opening that would allow him to break the tightening noose around his army. However, the sheer numbers of the coalition forces and their coordinated assault strategy thwarted his efforts at every turn. As the day wore on, the French position gradually contracted. Allied forces pushed forward relentlessly, slowly but surely gaining ground. The villages that had changed hands multiple times in previous days now fell one by one to the coalition. French soldiers, exhausted and running low on supplies, found themselves fighting with increasing desperation as their lines of retreat narrowed. The bloodiest fighting continued to rage in and around Probstheide. The Allies, driven by the presence of their monarchs on the battlefield, launched repeated assaults against the French defences. Each attack was met with fierce resistance, resulting in staggering casualties on both sides. Despite initial successes in repelling attacks, the French were gradually forced back throughout the day. Napoleon's tactical brilliance, which had secured him countless victories, could not overcome the sheer numbers and relentless pressure of the coalition. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the blood-soaked fields around Leipzig bore witness to a sobering truth. France was losing its grip on the battle. By nightfall on October 18th, 1813, Napoleon could no longer deny the inevitable. Surrounded and outmatched, he made the painful decision to order a retreat. This fateful moment signaled the beginning of a desperate withdrawal, one that would determine not just the fate of his army, but the future of his empire. Under the cover of darkness, Napoleon set his plan in motion. The French army began to move, their retreat hindered by a single bridge over the Elster River. This narrow passage became a choke point, testing the limits of Napoleon's strategic genius and his army's discipline. As dawn broke, Leipzig transformed into a maelstrom of chaos. The once orderly Grande Armée found itself in disarray, with soldiers struggling to maintain formation amidst the pandemonium. Napoleon's rear guard, tasked with covering the withdrawal, faced an immense challenge as they stood their ground against the advancing coalition forces. The coalition, sensing Napoleon's retreat, launched an all-out assault on Leipzig. The city became a battleground, with the French rearguard fighting to delay the Allied advance. The sound of musket fire and cannon blasts echoed through the narrow alleys, accompanied by the cries of wounded soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. As the fighting intensified, the French retreat grew increasingly desperate. Officers struggled to maintain order, while soldiers fought not for victory, but for survival. The bridge over the Elster River loomed as a treacherous gauntlet that each man had to run. Napoleon and his staff worked tirelessly to salvage what they could of the army and its equipment. Every cannon and wagon of supplies that could be saved was precious. The emperor, known for his attention to detail, now made split-second decisions that would determine the fate of thousands. As the coalition forces pressed deeper into Leipzig, the situation for the retreating French grew dire. The narrow streets that had once hindered the Allied advance now worked against the French, trapping them in a deadly maze. Soldiers who had fought side by side for years now found themselves separated, lost in the pandemonium of a city under siege. Then came the moment that would be etched into military history. A French corporal, tasked with destroying the Elster Bridge to halt the Allied pursuit, made a fateful error. Misinterpreting his orders, he ignited the fuse prematurely, while the bridge was still crowded with retreating French troops. The explosion that followed was catastrophic, both in its physical and psychological impact. In an instant, the last route of escape was severed, trapping approximately 30,000 French soldiers on the wrong side of the Elster. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. Soldiers, faced with the choice of capture or death, began to throw themselves into the churning waters of the river. Among those caught in this desperate situation was Marshal Józef Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most loyal and capable commanders. In a final act of defiance, Poniatowski attempted to swim across the Elster. The river, swollen by recent rains, proved too much for the wounded marshal. He disappeared beneath the waters, his fate a poignant symbol of the French army's collapse. The destruction of the bridge marked the final, chaotic phase of the French retreat from Leipzig. What had begun as an organized withdrawal spiraled into a desperate rout. Soldiers who had once stood unyielding against the might of Europe now scattered in panic, their hopes of escape shattered along with the bridge that was meant to save them. The once mighty Grande Armée lay fractured and demoralized, leaving thousands to face capture or death in the wake of this disaster. As the smoke cleared and the battlefield fell silent, the full scale of Napoleon's defeat came into focus. The carnage was staggering, even to those hardened by years of war. The French army, once feared across Europe, was left in ruins. Yet victory came at a steep cost for the coalition as well. In total, the battle had claimed approximately 122,000 casualties, 68,000 French killed, wounded, or captured, and 54,000 Allied losses. The Battle of Leipzig, the largest and bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars, had reshaped the fate of Europe. The distribution of casualties among the coalition armies revealed the intensity of the fighting across different sectors. Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia bore the brunt with 34,000 men lost, while Blücher's army of Silesia suffered 12,000 casualties. Bernadotte's army of the north and Bennigsen's army of Poland each lost about 4,000 men, highlighting the widespread nature of the combat. Among the fallen was Marshal Józef Poniatowski, a Polish prince loyal to Napoleon. Poniatowski's fate was particularly poignant, as he had been promoted to Maréchal d'Empire just days before the battle. He drowned while attempting to escape across the swollen Elster River, his newly acquired marshal's baton lost to the churning waters. The aftermath presented a scene of unimaginable horror. The battlefield conditions were nightmarish, with corpses littering the ground as far as the eye could see. The task of disposing of the dead overwhelmed the local population, and some bodies remained visible for months, a grim reminder of the cost of war. Leipzig, once a thriving center of commerce and culture, transformed into a vast makeshift hospital. Wounded soldiers crowded into every available space, their bodies broken and spirits shattered. The destruction of the Elster Bridge during the French retreat compounded the tragedy, trapping thousands of soldiers on the wrong side of the river. Many drowned in desperate attempts to escape, their bodies joining those of their fallen comrades. The battle's intensity was reflected in the unprecedented expenditure of ammunition. Over 400,000 rounds of artillery were fired, leaving the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Leipzig itself bore the scars of the titanic struggle, with buildings pockmarked by bullet holes and many lying in ruins. The battlefield extended far beyond the city limits, encompassing surrounding villages and farmland. Fields that once yielded bountiful harvests lay trampled and barren, churned into mud by the feet of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and the hooves of countless horses. The environmental impact would be felt for years, as nature slowly reclaimed the scarred landscape. For the survivors, the memories of Leipzig would haunt them for life. Many had witnessed the deaths of close friends and comrades, their bonds forged in combat now severed forever. The psychological trauma of such intense and prolonged fighting left deep scars, invisible wounds that would never fully heal. The Battle of Leipzig stood as a grim testament to the human cost of Napoleon's ambitions. It was more than just a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. It signaled a shift in the very nature of warfare. The sheer scale of the carnage and the unprecedented reliance on artillery foreshadowed the industrialized conflicts of the coming century, leaving scars not only on the landscape but on an entire generation's psyche. As the guns fell silent and the battlefield lay shrouded in smoke, Napoleon Bonaparte faced a new and grimmer reality. The conqueror of Europe was now a man on the run, with his army in ruins and his once unshakable reputation crumbling. He began a desperate retreat toward France, fighting not for dominance, but for survival. The coalition's victory at Leipzig unleashed a cascade of events that rapidly eroded French control over Central Europe. Napoleon's carefully constructed empire began to crumble like a grand edifice whose foundations had been suddenly undermined. Each passing day brought news of fresh losses and setbacks, as territories east of the Rhine slipped from his grasp. In the wake of Leipzig, Napoleon's allies abandoned him one by one, sensing the shifting tides of power. The Kingdom of Bavaria's defection to the coalition on October 8, 1813, symbolized the disintegration of Napoleon's system of alliances and highlighted the rising tide of German nationalism. This force would prove instrumental in dismantling French hegemony over the continent. The political consequences of the battle reverberated throughout France. A wave of unrest and war weariness swept over the populace, who had endured years of conflict and conscription. Napoleon's attempts to rally support for a final defense were met with growing skepticism and fatigue. The emperor's authority diminished both at home and abroad, like a once brilliant star fading from the night sky. Meanwhile, the coalition leaders, emboldened by their victory, wasted no time in capitalizing on Napoleon's weakened position. Tsar Alexander I of Russia urged his fellow monarchs to maintain the momentum of their triumph. Plans for a coordinated invasion of France were swiftly put into motion, with the Allied forces poised to strike in early 1814. As the Allies advanced, the French Empire continued to unravel. Local revolts erupted in the Illyrian provinces, while Austrian forces pushed into northern Italy. Each new front that opened stretched the already depleted French resources to their breaking point. Napoleon's reputation as a military genius, once the cornerstone of his power, now lay in ruins. The loss of two armies in consecutive years, first in Russia and now at Leipzig, shattered his perceived invincibility. The balance of power in Europe underwent a seismic shift. Prussia emerged as a resurgent force on the continent, reclaiming its status as a major power. This realignment would have far-reaching consequences for the future of European politics and diplomacy. In France, Napoleon found himself caught between the advancing coalition armies and a restless populace. His efforts to raise new armies and fortify the nation's defences were hampered by dwindling resources and waning public support. The emperor, who had once commanded the loyalty and admiration of millions, now struggled to maintain control over his own country. As Napoleon studied the map of his shrinking empire, the stark reality of his downfall became undeniable. The territories he had spent years conquering were slipping from his grasp, and the alliances he had so carefully forged were unraveling. The man who had once seemed capable of shaping history itself now stood vulnerable, his dominance fading. The collapse of French authority in Central Europe, coupled with the surging tide of German nationalism, signaled not just the decline of an empire, but the birth of a new political order. Yet the true impact of Leipzig was only beginning to unfold. As the dust settled on the blood-soaked fields, the consequences of Napoleon's defeat rippled across the continent. French supremacy in Europe had come to a decisive end, paving the way for a new era of geopolitical realignment and national awakening. The Battle of Leipzig, rightly called the Battle of Nations, was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point that would reshape Europe for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of Leipzig saw the rapid dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine and the end of French control over German territories east of the Rhine. This created a power vacuum quickly filled by rising powers, particularly Prussia, which emerged to reclaim its status as a major European force. The battle's impact on military strategy was profound, as the scale of the conflict forced a reconsideration of modern warfare. High casualty rates and brutal fighting led to a reassessment of tactics, logistics, and the purpose of warfare in the 19th century and beyond. In the wake of Napoleon's defeat, a wave of nationalism swept across Europe, especially in German-speaking lands. The battle had demonstrated the power of united action, inspiring movements for unification and independence. This surge of national sentiment would play a crucial role in shaping Europe's political landscape, eventually leading to the unification of Germany and Italy. The Battle of Leipzig, like a crucible of fire, forged a new European destiny. It reshaped the balance of power among nations, with Russia emerging as a dominant force and the United Kingdom solidifying its position as a global power broker. Austria found itself increasingly challenged by Prussia's rise in German affairs, while France's influence waned significantly. The psychological impact on Napoleon was profound, shattering his reputation as an undefeatable military genius. This shift in perception emboldened his enemies and weakened support among allies and subjects, setting the stage for his eventual abdication and exile. The French population, weary from years of warfare, began to question the emperor's leadership. In the collective memory of nations involved, Leipzig holds a special place. It has been immortalized in art, literature, and historical scholarship, reflecting its importance in shaping national identities and historical narratives. The battle continues to be the subject of scholarly debates, analyzing strategic decisions, the role of individual commanders, and its long-term historical significance. The Völkerschlachtdenkmal, or Monument to the Battle of the Nations, completed in 1913 in Leipzig, stands as a powerful testament to the battle's enduring legacy. This colossal structure, 91 meters tall, serves as a reminder of Leipzig's significance in German and European history. Its completion, a century after the battle, demonstrates how the memory of Leipzig continued to resonate through generations, shaping national identity and historical consciousness. The Battle of Leipzig stands as a pivotal moment in European history, its consequences rippling far beyond the battlefield. From military doctrine to national identities, from shifting alliances to cultural memory, its impact was profound and far-reaching. It marked not just the fall of an empire, but the dawn of a new era, one that would redefine the balance of power in Europe for generations to come. For Napoleon, Leipzig was the beginning of an irreversible descent from the heights of power. As the shattered remnants of his once mighty Grande Armée retreated across the Rhine, the emperor found himself increasingly cornered. Sensing their moment, the coalition forces seized the initiative, pressing their advantage with relentless determination. By early 1814, they had launched a series of coordinated invasions into France, setting the stage for the final chapter of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon mounted a desperate defense of his homeland, achieving several remarkable victories in the 6 Days Campaign. However, these successes proved to be merely temporary setbacks for the coalition. The sheer numerical superiority of the Allied armies, combined with Napoleon's dwindling resources and manpower, made the outcome inevitable. As Paris fell to coalition forces on March 31st, 1814, Napoleon's grip on power finally slipped away. Abandoned by many of his marshals and facing overwhelming odds, the emperor abdicated his throne on April 6, 1814, bringing an end to his imperial reign and the First French Empire. The coalition powers exiled Napoleon to the Mediterranean island of Elba, a decision that would prove to be a grave miscalculation. Despite being granted sovereignty over the small island, Napoleon's ambitions remained undiminished. He set about reforming the island's economy and administration, showcasing the same organizational skills that had once allowed him to dominate much of Europe. However, these activities were merely a facade, masking his true intentions. In February 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba. Landing on the French coast with a small force of loyal followers, he embarked on a remarkable journey that would see him regain control of France without firing a single shot. This period, known as the 100 Days, witnessed a brief resurgence of Napoleonic fervor as the emperor reclaimed his throne and rallied his supporters. The news of Napoleon's return sent shockwaves through Europe, and the coalition quickly reassembled its forces. On June 18, 1815, near the small Belgian village of Waterloo, Napoleon faced off against the combined forces of Britain and Prussia, led by the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher. The battle was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Despite initial French successes, the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements sealed Napoleon's fate. As the sun set on the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo, Napoleon's dreams of restored glory lay in ruins. In the aftermath of this final defeat, Napoleon once again abdicated and surrendered himself to British custody. The coalition powers, determined not to repeat their previous mistake, exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Under strict British supervision, the former emperor spent his remaining years in isolation, his world reduced to a few square miles of windswept rock. Despite his confinement, Napoleon's mind remained active. He spent much of his time on St. Helena, reflecting on his life and legacy, dictating his memoirs, and engaging in discussions about his past campaigns and the future of Europe. These reflections would later be compiled into works that continue to influence military and political thought to this day. Meanwhile, the Congress of Vienna resumed its monumental task of reshaping Europe. In the aftermath of Napoleon's final defeat, the decisions made within its halls would have profound and lasting consequences, redrawing borders, restoring monarchies, and establishing a balance of power that would define European politics for decades. Determined to prevent the rise of another dominant force like Napoleon, the Congress sought to create stability by containing France and reinforcing the principle of legitimacy, reinstating many of the monarchs he had deposed. The Battle of Leipzig had already set these transformations in motion. It marked the end of Napoleon's continental supremacy and a seismic shift in the balance of power. As the dust settled, its repercussions rippled across the continent, reshaping alliances, national identities, and the very fabric of European politics. Leipzig's legacy extended far beyond its immediate aftermath, serving as a defining moment in history. Even today, it stands as a stark reminder of the cyclical nature of power and the enduring lessons of history. Napoleon himself captured the gravity of his reversal with a simple yet poignant reflection. A year ago, all Europe marched with us. Today, all Europe marches against us. Battle of Waterloo. But history had not finished with Napoleon Bonaparte, nor he with it. Though Leipzig had stripped him of his empire, his spirit remained unbroken. Impossible is a word to be found only in the dictionary of fools, he had once declared, and in 1815 he would prove these words prophetic. In an audacious move that stunned Europe, the exiled emperor escaped his island prison of Elba, reclaimed his throne, and challenged the continent one last time. Napoleon's arrival on Elba in May 1814 marked a stark contrast to his former glory as the Emperor of France. The island, measuring only 224 square kilometers, became his new domain following the Treaty of Fontainebleau. This agreement, while stripping Napoleon of his powers over France and its empire, granted him sovereignty over Elba and allowed him to retain the title of emperor. However, this new empire was a far cry from the vast territories he once commanded. Despite the trappings of his imperial title, Napoleon faced significant challenges on Elba. Financial difficulties plagued him from the outset, as the French government failed to pay the promised annual pension of 2 million francs. The isolation of island life stood in stark contrast to the bustling courts and battlefields of Europe he once knew. Napoleon's restless energy and administrative acumen did not diminish in exile. He quickly set about implementing reforms on the small island, demonstrating that his capacity for governance remained undiminished. He initiated public works projects, improved the island's infrastructure, and attempted to boost the local economy. These efforts, while on a much smaller scale than his previous endeavors, showcased Napoleon's inability to remain idle, even in exile. Throughout his time on Elba, Napoleon maintained a network of informants who kept him apprised of events unfolding in France and across Europe. This intelligence network proved crucial in shaping his future plans. Reports began to reach him of growing dissatisfaction with the restored Bourbon monarchy in France. The government of Louis XVIII, attempting to turn back the clock on many of the reforms of the revolutionary and Napoleonic eras was increasingly unpopular among certain segments of the population. The Congress of Vienna, convened in September 1814 to reorganize Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, became a source of particular concern for Napoleon. Discussions at the Congress about potentially moving him further from Europe, perhaps to a remote Atlantic island, added a sense of urgency to his plans. The prospect of being sent even further into exile, away from the continent he had once dominated, likely played a significant role in hastening Napoleon's decision to attempt an escape. As reports of discontent in France continued to reach him, Napoleon began to see an opportunity for a return to power. He started to make preparations for his escape, conducting these plans in utmost secrecy. The logistics of this operation were complex, involving the procurement of ships, the gathering of supplies, and the coordination with a small group of loyal followers. On February 26, 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon set sail from Elba with a force of approximately 1,000 men. This small contingent, composed mainly of members of his Imperial Guard who had accompanied him into exile, would form the core of his attempt to regain power in France. The departure was timed carefully to coincide with the temporary absence of British naval patrols in the area. As Napoleon's ships slipped away from Elba's shores, the stage was set for one of history's most audacious comebacks. The fallen emperor was staking everything on a bold gamble, banking on his reputation and the growing discontent with the Bourbon monarchy to rally support. In the coming weeks, his fate would be decided. Would he reclaim his throne, or would this final bid for power end in crushing defeat? On March 1st, 1815, the shores of France loomed before him, a land he had once ruled, now a battleground of divided loyalties. His landing near Antibes marked the start of a daring campaign that sent shockwaves across Europe. With only 1,000 men at his side, Napoleon's return was nothing short of a high-stakes gamble, a desperate bid to reclaim an empire that had slipped from his grasp. As he stepped onto French soil, every encounter would determine his destiny. Triumph or disaster hung in the balance. In Antibes, royalist forces stood firm in their allegiance to the Bourbon monarchy, refusing to join Napoleon's cause. This initial setback demonstrated the precarious nature of Napoleon's position and the conflicting sentiments that permeated France. The country, still reeling from years of war and political upheaval, was a powder keg of competing loyalties and ideologies. Undeterred, Napoleon chose to take a perilous route through the Alps, avoiding royalist strongholds that could have crushed his small force. This treacherous journey through mountainous terrain became a crucible that tested Napoleon's legendary charisma and the depth of loyalty within the French army. As they traversed the challenging alpine landscape, word of his return began to spread throughout France, eliciting mixed reactions. The pivotal moment of Napoleon's march came at Laffrey, where he faced a royalist battalion sent to arrest him. Napoleon's understanding of the French psyche came to the fore as he stepped forward to confront the soldiers directly. With open arms and unwavering confidence, he uttered the famous words, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." This bold declaration, fraught with personal risk, showcased Napoleon's charisma and psychological mastery. The battalion, faced with the man who had once led them to glory, found themselves unable to raise their weapons. Instead, cries of "Vive l'Empereur" erupted from the ranks as the soldiers rallied to Napoleon's side. This dramatic reversal at Laffrey became a turning point, transforming Napoleon's march from a desperate gamble into a triumphal procession. As news spread, it galvanized support across France. Former soldiers, yearning for the glory days of the empire, flocked to join his growing force. Civilians, too, began to rally to his cause, drawn by the promise of a strong leader who understood their aspirations. Napoleon's understanding of the need for popular support was evident in the proclamation he issued upon landing. He called upon the French army to join him, stating that if the people and army did not want him, he would be finished. This acknowledgement of the power of public opinion demonstrated Napoleon's political acumen and his recognition that his return could not succeed through military might alone. As Napoleon advanced towards Paris, the restored Bourbon monarchy found itself increasingly isolated. The rapid defection of troops and the growing enthusiasm among the populace revealed the fragility of Louis XVIII's rule. The king, who had been placed on the throne by the Allied powers, lacked the charisma and connection to the French people that Napoleon possessed. On March 20th, 1815, less than 3 weeks after landing near Antibes, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph. His return had been nothing short of astonishing. He had reclaimed the French throne without firing a single shot. The ease with which he displaced the Bourbon monarchy sent shockwaves through Europe's royal courts, where rulers had believed his threat had been permanently extinguished. But Napoleon's resurgence did more than just unsettle the monarchs of Europe. It shattered the fragile peace they had worked so hard to establish. The Allied powers, who had seen him as a spent force, now faced a resurrected adversary, capable of rallying an entire nation to his cause. The post-war order lay in ruins, and once again, the continent stood on the precipice of war. The news of Napoleon's escape reached the Congress of Vienna, where representatives of Europe's great powers were still embroiled in negotiations to reshape the continent's political landscape. The reaction was swift and unequivocal. The Allied powers, including the United Kingdom, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, quickly mobilized their armies, each contributing 150,000 troops to form the Seventh Coalition. This formidable force, assembled with unprecedented speed, demonstrated the gravity of the threat Napoleon posed to the established order. The formation of the Seventh Coalition represented more than just a military alliance. It was a direct reaction to the ideals Napoleon embodied. The Allied powers sought not only to restore the Bourbon monarchy, but also to prevent the resurgence of revolutionary principles that had upended the traditional European order. Napoleon, despite his imperial trappings, remained a symbol of change and upheaval in the eyes of conservative monarchs across the continent. Within France, Napoleon faced the monumental challenge of uniting a deeply divided nation. The political landscape had shifted dramatically during his exile, with various factions vying for power and influence. Royalists, who had welcomed the return of the Bourbons, now found themselves at odds with Napoleon's supporters. Moderate Republicans, too, harbored suspicions about the emperor's true intentions, remembering his authoritarian tendencies during his previous reign. In an attempt to bridge these divides and win popular support, Napoleon issued the Additional Act, a liberal constitution that promised to address many of the grievances that had emerged during the Bourbon Restoration. This document aimed to establish a constitutional monarchy, balancing Napoleon's authority with greater personal freedoms and representative government. It was a calculated move to appeal to the liberal factions within France and to present himself as a reformer rather than a conqueror. Napoleon's efforts at domestic reform extended beyond the Additional Act. He made concerted attempts to appeal to various political groups, emphasizing his commitment to the ideals of the French Revolution, while also promising stability and order. However, his past as an emperor and his well-known militaristic ambitions cast long shadows over these overtures. Many remained skeptical, viewing his promises of reform as mere political maneuvering rather than genuine change. Despite Napoleon's efforts to reconcile with various factions and present a united front to the world, the political climate in France remained tense and volatile. The emperor found himself walking a tightrope, attempting to satisfy conflicting demands from different segments of society, while also preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Allied powers. On March 20th, 1815, less than 3 weeks after landing near Antibes, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph. His return was nothing short of extraordinary. He had reclaimed the French throne without a single shot being fired. The ease with which he swept aside the Bourbon monarchy sent shockwaves through Europe's royal courts, where rulers had believed his threat was extinguished for good. Yet Napoleon's resurgence did more than unsettle Europe's monarchs. It shattered the fragile peace they had struggled to build. The Allied powers, who had dismissed him as a relic of the past, now faced a resurrected adversary capable of reigniting the fires of war. The post-war order lay in tatters, and once again, the continent stood on the brink of conflict. The task before Napoleon was monumental, akin to raising a phoenix from the ashes. The French army had been severely depleted, its ranks thinned by countless battles across the continent. The loss of experienced soldiers, particularly during the Russian campaign, left a critical void in manpower and expertise. Napoleon's strategic genius faced its ultimate test as he sought to transform this dire situation into a fighting force capable of challenging his numerous adversaries. To address the critical manpower shortage, Napoleon implemented bold measures. He summoned retired veterans back to service, their invaluable experience crucial for the coming conflict. Simultaneously, he accelerated recruit training, compressing months of instruction into weeks. This rapid approach aimed to bolster the ranks with fresh troops, though their inexperience remained a concern. Napoleon's return ignited French patriotism, aiding his recruitment efforts. Citizens across France, inspired by his audacious comeback, joined the army in droves. This enthusiasm helped swell the ranks, though it could not fully compensate for the loss of seasoned veterans. Central to Napoleon's military reconstruction was the reconstitution of the Imperial Guard. This elite force, embodying French military prowess, had long been the emperor's most reliable battlefield instrument. Napoleon prioritized rebuilding this corps of professional soldiers, recognizing their potential to be decisive in the coming struggle. Despite these efforts, Napoleon grappled with severe economic constraints that threatened to undermine his campaign. The French economy, battered by years of warfare and recent political upheaval, struggled to meet the enormous demands of rearmament. This economic reality forced difficult choices, prioritizing certain aspects of military preparation while leaving others inadequate. The strategic situation was equally dire. Allied powers, determined to prevent Napoleon's resurgence, mobilized on multiple fronts. Approximately 850,000 Allied soldiers stood poised to confront him, creating a strategic nightmare. Napoleon found himself compelled to defend against potential invasions from several directions simultaneously, stretching his limited resources to the breaking point. In response, Napoleon devised a characteristically audacious strategy. He aimed to strike quickly and decisively, seeking to isolate and defeat Allied forces separately before they could unite their overwhelming numbers. This plan relied heavily on surprise and rapid movement, hoping to achieve victories that would rally support within France and sow discord among the Allies. By June 1815, Napoleon had assembled an army of about 125,000 men for his northern campaign. While remarkable given the circumstances, this force fell far short of his initial 300,000 troop goal and represented only a fraction of the once mighty Grande Armée. The army marching to meet the Allies primarily comprised loyal veterans who had previously served under Napoleon, a corps of experienced soldiers upon whom he pinned his hopes. As Napoleon prepared to confront the Allied armies, the odds were stacked against him. His force of 125,000 men, though formidable, was dwarfed by the combined strength of his enemies. At Waterloo, he would command approximately 74,500 troops, including 54,014 infantry, 15,830 cavalry, and 8,775 artillery, with 254 guns. Opposing him stood Wellington's Allied army of around 68,000 soldiers, reinforced by nearly 50,000 Prussians under Blücher, an overwhelming force determined to end his rule once and for all. At dawn on June 15th, 1815, Napoleon launched a daring offensive that stunned even his most seasoned adversaries. Under the cover of darkness, the French army crossed the Belgian frontier near Charleroi, catching the Allies completely off guard. This bold maneuver marked the opening act of his final campaign, a desperate bid to reclaim his empire and once again reshape the fate of Europe. The element of surprise proved devastating to the coalition forces. Many high-ranking Allied officers, including the Duke of Wellington himself, were attending a lavish ball in Brussels, unaware of the approaching storm. As news of the French advance trickled in, panic spread through the ranks of the unprepared coalition armies. Napoleon's strategy of rapid movement and unexpected attack, reminiscent of his earlier campaigns, had once again thrown his enemies into disarray. The French army's initial thrust met with swift success. Allied outposts, caught unawares, were rapidly overrun, creating a cascade of confusion among the coalition forces. This chaos played directly into Napoleon's hands, as he sought to exploit the gap between the two main Allied armies, the Anglo-Allied force under Wellington to the west and the Prussian army under Blücher to the east. Napoleon's plan hinged on a crucial strategic decision. Like a river dividing into two branches, he split his forces. Marshal Ney was entrusted with engaging Wellington's army, while Napoleon personally led the main French force against Blücher's Prussians. This division of forces was a calculated risk, aiming to prevent the Allied armies from joining forces. But it also posed a significant challenge to coordination and communication between the two French contingents. The Belgian landscape presented formidable obstacles. Relentless rain had transformed the terrain into a treacherous quagmire, where every step was a battle against nature itself. Troops and artillery alike struggled through the mire, their progress slowed to a crawl. Yet, the French army pressed on, their determination fueled by loyalty to their returned emperor and the promise of victory. As night fell on June 16th, Napoleon had achieved a remarkable feat. In just 2 days of rapid maneuvering, he had successfully positioned his army between the Allied forces, creating a wedge that threatened to keep them divided. This central position offered Napoleon a golden opportunity to defeat his enemies in detail, confronting each army separately before they could combine their strength. The strategic significance of Napoleon's opening moves was profound. By seizing the initiative and driving deep into Belgian territory, he aimed not only to defeat the British and Prussian forces, but also to regain control over the region. Success here could potentially rally support from French-speaking sympathizers in Belgium, bolstering his forces and legitimacy. However, the challenges facing Napoleon were formidable. His army, though skilled and motivated, was significantly outnumbered. The French force of approximately 125,000 men faced Allied armies, totaling around 218,000 soldiers when combined. Moreover, Many of Napoleon's troops were either veterans recalled from retirement or hastily trained recruits, a far cry from the seasoned Grande Armée of his earlier campaigns. As news of the French advance finally reached Wellington, late on the night of June 15th, the Allied commander was forced to hastily concentrate his forces at Quatre Bras. This reactive posture highlighted the effectiveness of Napoleon's surprise attack, which had seized the initiative and forced the Allies onto the back foot. The rapid French advance had another, less tangible effect. It reignited the fear and respect that Napoleon's name had once commanded across Europe. The speed and audacity of his maneuvers served as a stark reminder of the military genius that had dominated the continent for over a decade. Napoleon hoped this psychological edge would tip the scales in his favor as the campaign unfolded. By midday, on June 16, 1815, Napoleon was preparing to confront one of his most formidable adversaries. The village of Ligny, nestled in present-day Belgium, would soon bear witness to the emperor's last great victory. On one side stood the French army, 68,000 strong. On the other, Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher's Prussian force of approximately 84,000 troops. The stage was set for a battle that would shape the fate of Europe. The battle commenced in the early afternoon, with the French launching fierce attacks on the Prussian positions. The village of Ligny, situated along a small stream, became the focal point of the conflict. The narrow streets and stone buildings provided excellent defensive positions for the Prussians, who fought tenaciously to hold their ground. As the fighting intensified, the air filled with smoke and the deafening roar of cannon fire. Napoleon, ever the master tactician, held back his elite Imperial Guard, composed of battle-hardened veterans. He waited patiently for the opportune moment to deliver a decisive blow that would shatter the Prussian lines. While the battle raged at Ligny, a parallel engagement unfolded at the nearby crossroads of Quatre Bras. Marshal Michel Ney, tasked with capturing this strategic position and then attacking the Prussian flank at Ligny, encountered unexpected resistance from Allied forces under the command of the Prince of Orange and the Duke of Wellington. Ney's failure to secure Quatre Bras had significant implications, forcing Napoleon to adapt his strategy and rely more heavily on frontal attacks to break through the Prussian defences. As the afternoon wore on, casualties mounted on both sides. The villages of Saint-Amand and Ligny became charnel houses, with bodies piling up in the streets and buildings reduced to smouldering ruins. The Prussian centre, anchored around the village of Ligny, began to show signs of strain under the relentless French assault. With daylight fading and the battle hanging in the balance, Napoleon saw his opportunity. He ordered his Imperial Guard into action, committing these elite troops to a final, decisive assault on the Prussian centre. The sight of the Guard's bearskin hats and the thunder of their drums as they advanced struck fear into the hearts of even the most resolute Prussian defenders. The Imperial Guard's attack proved to be the turning point of the battle. The exhausted Prussian troops, who had fought valiantly throughout the day, began to waver under the pressure. As the French pushed forward, the Prussian centre finally cracked, and their lines began to disintegrate. In the chaos of the retreat, Field Marshal Blücher found himself in mortal danger. The 72-year-old commander, known for his aggressive tactics and personal bravery, was trapped beneath his dead horse after being caught in a cavalry charge. For heart-stopping moments, it seemed the Prussian leader might fall into French hands, potentially dealing a devastating blow to the Allied cause. In a dramatic turn of events, Blücher's own men managed to rescue him from the jaws of capture, allowing him to escape the battlefield. As night fell, the French emerged victorious. Napoleon had secured a significant tactical success, dealing heavy losses to the Prussians and forcing them into retreat. Ligny would stand as his last great battlefield triumph, a victory that momentarily rekindled the brilliance of his past glories and reaffirmed his legendary military prowess. Even as Napoleon celebrated his success, another crucial battle was unfolding. At dawn on June 16th, 1815, the Battle of Quatre Bras erupted at a vital crossroads where two main roads intersected. Control of this strategic point was essential for the Allies, as it ensured Wellington's connection with Blücher's Prussian army. Recognizing its importance, Napoleon entrusted Marshal Michel Ney with the task of seizing Quatre Bras, aiming to drive a wedge between the Allied forces and disrupt their coordination. Initially, only a small Dutch-Belgian force under the Prince of Orange held Quatre Bras, presenting what seemed like a golden opportunity for a swift French victory. However, Ney's cautious nature and conflicting orders from Napoleon led to critical delays in launching his assault. The battle began in earnest around 2 p.m., when Ney finally ordered his troops to advance. The initial French attacks made good progress, pushing back the outnumbered Allied defenders. As the afternoon wore on, the situation grew increasingly chaotic. Units from both sides streamed into the battlefield piecemeal, creating a constantly shifting and unpredictable engagement. The death of Frederick William, Duke of Brunswick, marked a dramatic turning point. Leading his Black Brunswickers in a bold charge to stem a French advance, the Duke was struck by a French musket ball and mortally wounded. His fall sent shockwaves through the Allied ranks, nearly breaking their line and momentarily tipping the balance in Ney's favour. Yet Ney's indecisiveness continued to plague the French effort. Despite having a significant cavalry force at his disposal, including the elite cuirassiers, Ney hesitated to commit these troops to a decisive charge. This reluctance stemmed partly from conflicting reports about Allied strength, and partly from Ney's own exhaustion after days of intense campaigning. His failure to utilize the cavalry reserves effectively would prove to be a critical missed opportunity. As more Allied reinforcements arrived, Wellington himself reached the battlefield in the late afternoon, taking personal command of the defense. The Duke's presence galvanized the Allied troops, who fought with renewed determination. Wellington expertly directed the arriving units, plugging gaps in the line and organizing counterattacks to keep the French off balance. The fighting raged on into the evening, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The fields and woods around Quatre Bras became a nightmarish landscape of smoke, mud, and bloodshed. French infantry repeatedly charged Allied positions, only to be driven back by withering musket fire and cavalry countercharges. The Allied forces, though hard-pressed, managed to hold their ground through sheer determination and the steady influx of fresh troops. By nightfall, the battle had essentially fought itself to a stalemate. Ney's attacks had lost their momentum, and the French troops were exhausted. The Allied forces, while battered, still held the crucial crossroads. Wellington had achieved his primary objective of maintaining his position and preserving his link with Blücher's Prussians. The outcome of Quatre Bras carried profound implications for Napoleon's campaign. Ney's failure to seize this crucial crossroads allowed Wellington and Blücher to maintain communication and coordinate their movements, an advantage that would prove decisive in the days ahead. With their ability to support each other intact, the Allied forces remained a formidable threat, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would determine Napoleon's fate. In the wake of Ligny and Quatre Bras, a critical phase of maneuvering began, one that would ultimately shape the course of European history. As the dust settled from these fierce engagements, Napoleon turned his attention to the Duke of Wellington, believing he had effectively neutralized the Prussian threat. Yet this confidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Napoleon made a fateful decision to detach Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians under Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. His intent was to prevent the Prussians from regrouping and potentially rejoining Wellington's forces. This division of his army, while seemingly logical, carried significant risks and would have far-reaching consequences in the days to come. Wellington, upon learning of the Prussian defeat at Ligny, initiated a skillful retrograde movement towards the village of Waterloo. This retreat was a calculated strategy to consolidate his position and maintain the possibility of linking up with Blücher's forces. Wellington's tactical acumen was on full display as he carefully selected his route, managing the pace of his withdrawal with precision. Nature, however, intervened in the affairs of men. A torrential downpour transformed the Belgian countryside into a quagmire, significantly impeding Napoleon's pursuit of Wellington. The French advance was reduced to a laborious slog through mud-clogged roads. Artillery pieces and supply wagons struggled to make headway in the treacherous conditions, while infantry and cavalry found their progress painfully slow. This delay, born of the elements, served as both a tactical setback for Napoleon and a symbol of the unpredictable forces shaping the campaign's outcome. Despite these setbacks, Napoleon remained optimistic. He was convinced that his maneuvering had successfully driven a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, leaving him free to defeat each in turn. This belief was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of Prussian movements following Ligny. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, Blücher's forces were marching northward, maintaining a trajectory that kept them within supporting distance of Wellington's army. At the heart of this crucial choice was Field Marshal Blücher himself. Despite suffering significant injuries during the Battle of Ligny, including being trapped beneath his dead horse during a cavalry charge, the 72-year-old marshal made the momentous decision to march to Wellington's aid. This resolution, made in the face of physical pain and recent defeat, would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire campaign. As June 17th drew to a close, Wellington had successfully established a formidable defensive position just south of the village of Waterloo. The Allied army was now arrayed across a ridge that offered significant tactical advantages. Wellington, ever the master of defensive warfare, had chosen his ground with care, maximizing the natural contours of the land to strengthen his position. The French forces, delayed by the inclement weather and difficult terrain, found themselves facing a well-prepared enemy. Napoleon, who had hoped to catch Wellington in retreat, was instead confronted with the prospect of a pitched battle against an opponent of his choosing. The Emperor, however, remained confident in his ability to achieve a decisive victory. As night fell on June 17th, the stage was set for one of history's most consequential battles. The fate of Europe rested on a delicate balance of factors: the timing of Prussian reinforcements, the resilience of Wellington's defensive line, and Napoleon's ability to strike before his enemies could unite. The coming day would decide the future of an empire. At dawn on June 18th, 1815, the first light revealed a landscape on the brink of history. The fields surrounding the small Belgian village of Waterloo were sodden and shrouded in mist. The ground churned into a treacherous quagmire by the previous night's heavy rains. Across the muddy terrain, two formidable armies stood poised for battle, their commanders fully aware that the events of this day would shape the course of Europe for generations to come. The Duke of Wellington, commanding the Allied forces, had chosen his ground with care. His troops were arrayed along a ridge that offered significant tactical advantages. Key to his defensive strategy were two strong points: the chateau of Hougomont to the west and the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte directly in front of his centre. These fortified positions would serve as bastions against the French assault, anchoring Wellington's line and providing crucial firepower. Napoleon Bonaparte surveyed the battlefield with a keen eye, his plan characteristically bold. He intended to launch a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, drawing off Wellington's reserves before striking decisively at the Allied centre. The French emperor exuded confidence, but the sodden ground posed a significant challenge. Artillery wheels sank deep into the mud, and infantry formations struggled to maintain cohesion in the slippery conditions. Napoleon reportedly declared to his staff, "I have them. 9 chances to 10. The victory is mine." Yet with each passing hour, Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher's Prussian army drew closer to Wellington's aid. Tension mounted among the ranks on both sides as the morning wore on. Wellington's men, a diverse collection of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, stood ready behind the crest of the ridge. Many were inexperienced, their resolve soon to be tested. Napoleon's Grande Armée, by contrast, comprised largely veterans eager for battle, confident in their abilities and in the leadership of the little corporal. Yet even among these hardened soldiers, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the ranks. At approximately 11:30 a.m., the opening salvo of the Battle of Waterloo rang out. Napoleon's artillery began a bombardment of the Allied lines, signalling the start of the attack on Hougoumont. What was intended as a feint quickly evolved into a fierce struggle. The chateau, defended by elite British guards and their German allies, became a cauldron of intense fighting. French infantry surged forward, only to be met by withering fire from the defenders. The surrounding orchard and woods transformed into a labyrinth of skirmishes, with men fighting hand to hand among the trees and hedgerows. As the fighting at Hougoumont intensified, it began to draw in more French troops than Napoleon had anticipated. The chateau's defenders, though vastly outnumbered, repelled assault after assault with remarkable tenacity. The unexpected scale of the engagement forced Napoleon to adapt his plans, balancing the need to maintain pressure on this flank with his primary objective of breaking through Wellington's centre. By early afternoon, as the struggle for Hougoumont continued unabated, Napoleon began preparations for his main assault on the Allied centre. The fate of Europe hung in the balance as the French columns formed up for what promised to be a decisive charge. Wellington, from his position on the reverse slope of the ridge, anxiously scanned the horizon for signs of Blücher's approaching Prussians. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke, the deafening roar of cannon fire, and the anguished cries of the wounded. Across the battlefield, tens of thousands of soldiers braced themselves, knowing that the coming clash would not only decide the outcome of the battle, but shape the future of the continent itself. As the afternoon of June 18th, 1815 unfolded, the Battle of Waterloo reached its decisive turning point. Sensing the urgency of the moment, Napoleon launched a massive assault on the centre of Wellington's line. His plan was clear: drive a wedge through the Allied forces, split them apart, and seize victory before the Prussians could arrive. This final push would test the resolve of both armies and determine the fate of Europe. The French advance, spearheaded by d'Erlon's infantry corps and supported by artillery, surged towards Wellington's centre. The Allied line, stretched thin across the ridge, faced its greatest challenge yet. The farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte became the focal point of the French assault. After fierce fighting, the French captured this crucial strongpoint, creating a dangerous bulge in Wellington's line. With this foothold established, Napoleon unleashed cavalry charges against the Allied infantry. Wellington's troops formed into defensive squares, endured these attacks with remarkable resilience. The Duke himself rode along the line, encouraging his men and directing the defense. "Stand fast, 95th, he called out to one hard-pressed regiment. "What will they say of this in England?" His presence bolstered the morale of his troops, who withstood charge after charge despite mounting casualties. The Allied squares became islands of red-coated soldiers in a sea of French cavalry. Time and again, the French horsemen crashed against these human fortresses, only to be repulsed by bristling rows of bayonets and disciplined musket fire. The carnage was immense, yet the Allied troops, though gradually worn down, held their ground. As the battle reached its climax, Napoleon prepared to commit his last reserve, the Imperial Guard. These elite veterans, instantly recognizable by their bearskin caps, had never known defeat. Their advance would be the final gambit to break Wellington's army before Prussian reinforcements could arrive in force. On the eastern edge of the battlefield, the first Prussian units under Field Marshal Blücher began to appear, threatening Napoleon's right flank. The Emperor now faced a race against time, needing to defeat Wellington before Blücher's full force could be brought to bear. As the Imperial Guard began its advance, a hush fell over the battlefield. Wellington, recognizing the critical moment, prepared his own surprise. The Duke had concealed a brigade of British guards behind the crest of the ridge. As the Imperial Guard approached, he ordered these fresh troops to stand and deliver a devastating volley. The effect was catastrophic. The French elite, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of this new force, staggered under the weight of fire. For the first time in its storied history, the Imperial Guard faltered. The sight of these invincible warriors hesitating and then falling back sent shockwaves through the French army. Cries of "La Garde, recule" spread like wildfire, sowing panic and disbelief among Napoleon's troops. This moment marked the beginning of the end for French hopes of victory. Sensing the moment was right, Wellington ordered a general advance. The Allied lines surged forward with renewed energy, while at the same time, Blücher's Prussians launched a ferocious assault on the French right flank. Trapped between these two relentless forces, the French army began to collapse. Order gave way to chaos as discipline crumbled and soldiers fled in disarray. Watching his final bid for power slip away, Napoleon could do nothing but retreat. As his staff urged him to leave the field, he reportedly muttered, "All is lost," before being escorted to safety. As the sun set on June 18th, 1815, the once mighty French army disintegrated into a chaotic retreat. The defeat of the elite Imperial Guard shattered any remaining morale, turning an organized withdrawal into a desperate flight. Soldiers abandoned their positions, discarded weapons, and left wounded comrades behind in their frantic bid to escape. Swept up in the tide of fleeing troops, Napoleon's attempts to rally his men proved futile. His empire had finally slipped from his grasp. Darkness fell, and the Prussian cavalry unleashed their fury upon the retreating French. Field Marshal Blücher, still nursing injuries from Ligny, led his men in relentless pursuit. The night echoed with thundering hooves and cries of the fallen as Prussian cavalry cut down fleeing soldiers. The panic gripping the French army was impervious even to the Emperor's legendary charisma. The Allied victory culminated in a meeting between the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher at the Inn of La Belle Alliance, marking the end of Napoleon's last campaign and the dawn of a new European era. While Allied leaders celebrated, Napoleon fled to Paris, arriving on June 21st as a mere shadow of his former self. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. His support had evaporated, replaced by demands for abdication. Faced with this stark reality, Napoleon briefly considered continuing the fight. However, as news of Waterloo's devastating outcome spread, it became clear that France had no appetite for further conflict. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time, writing to the French people, "My political life is ended, and I proclaim my son under the title of Napoleon II, Emperor of the French." This final attempt to secure his dynasty's future proved futile. In the following days, Napoleon found himself a prisoner in his own country, retreating to the palace of Malmaison. As Allied forces closed in on Paris, the former emperor made several thwarted attempts to escape France. Finally, on July 15th, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of the British Royal Navy. In a letter that would become famous, he wrote, "I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people." The British government, wary of Napoleon's enduring influence, exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. This tiny speck of land, measuring just 47 square miles, became Napoleon's final home and prison. As he sailed into exile, European powers gathered to reshape the continent in his absence. The Congress of Vienna reconvened to establish a new balance of power, determined to create a more stable Europe. Waterloo's aftermath saw a renewed commitment to suppress revolutionary ideals. European monarchies, shaken by Napoleon's brief resurgence, doubled down on conservative policies. This reactionary shift would influence European politics for decades to come. The conflict's enormous human cost was evident in the devastated landscape of northern Belgium, where fields lay scorched and littered with war's detritus. As Europe began to recover from the Napoleonic Wars, a new era dawned. Napoleon's defeat ushered in a period of relative peace, often referred to as the Pax Britannica. Britain emerged as the dominant global power, its naval supremacy unchallenged and its colonial empire expanding. The Battle of Waterloo and its consequences left an indelible mark on the European psyche, reshaping the continent's political landscape and setting the stage for the 19th century's global dynamics. Napoleon's 100 Days campaign marked the final chapter of the revolutionary era in Europe, with his defeat at Waterloo cementing the conservative order established by the Congress of Vienna. The impact of Napoleon's reign extended far beyond his military campaigns, shaping European politics and culture for generations. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of equality before the law and protection of private property, continued to influence legal systems across the continent. His vision of a unified Europe, though achieved through conquest, planted seeds that would later germinate into ideas of European integration. Today, historical sites like Waterloo invite reflection on Napoleon's complex legacy as both reformer and conqueror in the dramatic transformation of modern Europe.